Why did the general stop mid-stride when he saw her standing beside the rifle? Most people didn't even notice her at first. That was the strange part. A woman in a navy cardigan, silver hair pulled back neatly, hands resting on the massive frame of a .50 cal Barrett like it belonged there. Around her, Fort Liberty moved with practiced urgency, boots crunching on gravel, range officers shouting distances, metal clacking, wind snapping flags hard enough to sting the ears. She stood apart from it all, calm, unrushed, almost invisible. Eleanor Hartwell had spent most of her life being unseen. A staff sergeant noticed her eventually. He saw gray hair, civilian clothes, pearls at her ears. He didn't see the way her feet were planted, balanced. Didn't see how her hands moved over the rifle with quiet familiarity. He heard the safety rules in his own head louder than anything else. He heard risk. He heard responsibility pressing down on him. "Ma'am, you can't be here." She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, just said she was where she needed to be. That unsettled him more than defiance would have. Because authority expects resistance, it doesn't expect certainty. As their exchange drew attention, Eleanor felt the old sensation return, the one she'd known since her 20s. The feeling of being evaluated before being understood, judged before being known. It wasn't anger that surfaced in her chest. It was something quieter, something heavier. Patience. She had learned it the hard way, in places where impatience got people killed. The sergeant gestured toward her lapel where a small silver fang caught the sun. He asked what it was, his tone sharp with accusation. Unauthorized decorations. Stolen valor. Words that cut deeper than bullets ever had. For a moment, Eleanor touched the pin. And the range disappeared. Heat replaced Carolina air. Dust coated her tongue. Gunfire hammered her chest like fists. Mogadishu. A rooftop, a radio crackling with fear, young voices trusting her calm because they had nothing else to hold on to. She had been 40 then, younger, stronger, still learning what it meant to carry responsibility when everyone else was breaking. The memory passed, it always did. She looked back at the sergeant. Her voice was steady when she spoke. It had always been steady. Something like that. Across the range, a command sergeant major had stopped walking. A name had carried on the wind, Hartwell, and it lodged somewhere deep in his memory, somewhere he hadn't touched in years. He lifted binoculars with hands that suddenly didn't feel as steady as they should have. The posture, the stillness, the way she stood beside the rifle like an old friend. Recognition came like a punch. Phones were dialed, orders whispered, engines roared closer. By the time the convoy arrived, the staff sergeant was already in too deep to climb out. And Eleanor, still calm, still patient, waited. What kind of soldier earns a salute without asking for one? The vehicle stopped hard, dust blooming into the air. Doors opened. Boots hit ground with purpose. Conversations died mid-sentence. Soldiers straightened without being told. The general didn't look at the staff sergeant, didn't acknowledge him at all. He stopped in front of Eleanor Hartwell and saluted. It wasn't for show, it wasn't political, it was instinctive, muscle memory responding to something earned long ago. "Master Sergeant," he said, "it's an honor." Eleanor returned the greeting with a small smile, not pride, not triumph, recognition between people who had survived the same storms. Behind them the range stood frozen. Young soldiers stared, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they thought they knew. An old woman, a cardigan, a legend they'd never heard of. The general spoke then, not loudly but with weight. He told them who she was, where she had been, what she had done. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't need to. The facts carried their own gravity. Campaigns stacked like scars. Schools passed when passing meant most didn't. Deployments volunteered for when age said no, but conscience said yes. And the pin. The wolf's fang. a marker for those who hunted when others were hunted, for those who waited longer, watched closer, and made the one decision that mattered when everything else fell apart. The staff sergeant stood rigid, face drained of color. He realized then that his mistake wasn't procedural. It was human. He had looked without seeing. And Alina, who could have let the moment crush him, spoke instead. She defended his intent, corrected his assumptions, taught without humiliating. Because humiliation never made better soldiers. She asked for a demonstration. Not to prove herself. To teach her. Can experience fade, or does it sharpen with time? The wind picked up, heat shimmered. A target waited 2 kilometers away, small as doubt. Alina moved with ritual precision, not fast, not slow, exactly as needed. She spoke as she worked, explaining wind, thermals, expansion, details most people ignored because details demanded patience. The staff sergeant listened, truly listened, for the first time that day. She settled behind the rifle. Her breathing slowed. The world narrowed. When she fired, the sound hit like thunder. 2 seconds passed. Then the call came. Dead center. Cheers erupted. Or replaced skepticism. Something old and powerful stirred in the watching soldiers, a recognition of excellence that couldn't be faked. Alina cleared the weapon and stood. That wasn't my longest shot, she said quietly. And then she told them about Afghanistan, about a commander who stayed hidden, about math that said no and lives that demanded yes. She told them she had done it because someone had to. Not for records, not for recognition. Because dignity doesn't need witnesses. What happens when strength chooses mercy? Later, away from the crowd, Alina spoke with the staff sergeant. He apologized fully, honestly. She listened. Then she told him a story, about her own mistake, about dismissing an older man once, about learning that pride kills faster than bullets. She didn't punish him. She mentored him. Because the goal was never to win the moment. It was to shape the future. She offered him work, guidance, time. And with it, responsibility. Who carries the legacy forward? As the sun dipped low, a young female soldier approached Alina with doubt in her eyes, about strength, about belonging. Alina answered simply, about efficiency, about letting doubt become fuel, about standards that don't care who meets them, only that they are met. Different doesn't mean weaker, she said. The soldier stood taller when Alina left. And that mattered more than any applause. What remains after the rifle is set down. Alina drove away as the sky burned gold and purple behind her. Another lesson passed on, another chain unbroken. She didn't look back. She never had. Because the work was never about being remembered. It was about ensuring the next one stood stronger. And somewhere on that range, assumptions had cracked. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did no one step in when the tension kept tightening, when silence itself started to feel dangerous? The salute had ended, but the weight of it still hung in the air. Soldiers remained frozen, unsure whether to breathe, unsure whether what they just witnessed was real. A general didn't salute civilians. Not like that. Not with that kind of stillness. Not with that kind of respect. Alina Hartwell stood exactly where she had been before, beside the Barrett. Same posture, same calm. If not for the sudden shift in the atmosphere, she might have seemed unchanged. But inside her chest, something old stirred. Not pride, not triumph, memory. She hadn't planned to be seen today. That was the truth she didn't share. She had come to Fort Liberty because a quiet email had landed in her inbox 3 weeks earlier. An invitation, polite and vague, advisory capacity, range observation, optional participation, the kind of language institutions used when they weren't sure how much access to give someone who no longer fit neatly into their system. Elena almost deleted it. Her hands had hovered over the keyboard longer than she cared to admit. At 72, she had earned the right to say no. Earned the right to quiet mornings, to coffee without urgency, to days that didn't require vigilance. She had done more than enough. But then she remembered a letter she'd received years earlier, from a young staff sergeant stationed overseas. A woman, smart, capable, doubting herself because no one else seemed willing to believe in her yet. "You were the first name they told me about," the letter had said. "They said if I wanted to understand what right looked like, I should learn your story." Elena never replied, she rarely did, but the words stayed with her. So she came. Now standing on the firing line with a general's salute still echoing in the minds of 200 soldiers, she felt the familiar discomfort of attention. Legends were tidy, real lives were not. They left out the fear, the hesitation. The nights she lay awake replaying shots, wondering if she'd missed something she couldn't undo. The general turned away from her and addressed the range, his voice steady, controlled. He explained, educated, contextualized. But Elena watched the staff sergeant. Garrett Blackwood hadn't moved. His face was rigid, jaw clenched, eyes fixed straight ahead. He looked like someone standing at the edge of a cliff, realizing too late how far down the fall would be, not just professionally, personally. Elena recognized that look. She had worn it once herself. Years ago in a humid operations center overseas, when she had realized she dismissed a warning because it didn't come from the voice she expected. She'd been lucky that day. The consequences hadn't been fatal, but the lesson had carved itself deep into her. She shifted slightly, the silver fang at her lapel catching the light again. The general's explanation continued, but the range had stopped being about him. Soldiers leaned forward, not with excitement, but with something quieter, attention. The kind that came when expectations were shattered and replaced with something heavier. Truth. When the general finished, he turned back to Elena, lowering his voice. "You don't owe anyone an explanation, ma'am." She nodded, "I know." That was the moment she decided. She hadn't planned to shoot today. The Barrett was there because it always was, an old companion she trusted more than most people. But she saw the lesson forming in the faces around her, saw the doubt battling with belief, saw the staff sergeant's fear hardening into something defensive. Words alone wouldn't reach them. Experience would. "I'd like to validate my qualifications," she said calmly. The general studied her. He knew what she was doing. He also knew he couldn't stop her. Some things, once offered, couldn't be refused without doing more harm than good. He nodded. And just like that, the range changed shape. Orders moved quickly. Shooters cleared lanes. Safety protocols snapped into place with crisp efficiency. Soldiers repositioned, murmurs rippling through the formation. Some were excited. Some were skeptical. Most were simply curious. Elena ignored it all. She always had. She approached the Barrett with the same care she had shown it decades earlier. Not reverence, familiarity. She checked the chamber, the bolt, the scope, each movement precise, economical. There was no rush. Rushing belonged to people who didn't trust their process. As she worked, she felt eyes on her. Young eyes, measuring eyes, some respectful, some doubtful. She remembered being on the other side of that gaze. Back when she had been the anomaly. Back when she had learned to let doubt wash over her without absorbing it. The staff sergeant was assigned as her spotter. He moved stiffly, hands slightly unsteady as he set up the scope beside her. Elena noticed, said nothing. Teaching required patience, not commentary. "Tell me what you see," she said quietly. He hesitated, then answered, "Target, distance, conditions." She guided him, not correcting but expanding. Wind layers, terrain effects, heat, the invisible variables that separated competent shooters from true marksmen. As she spoke, something shifted in his posture. His fear didn't vanish, but it softened. Curiosity crept in where certainty had once lived. That mattered. Alina settled behind the rifle, body aligning with practiced ease. Despite the years, despite the stiffness that came with age, her form was flawless. Not because she forced it, but because she had never stopped refining it. Her breathing slowed, the noise of the range faded. This wasn't about proving she still could. It was about showing what experience looked like when it was respected instead of dismissed. She waited, not for silence, for rhythm. When the shot broke, it wasn't dramatic to her. It never was, just another moment where preparation met opportunity. The impact came later, and with it, a collective exhale from the watching soldiers. Alina stood, clearing the weapon. She didn't smile, not yet. She turned slightly toward the staff sergeant. That wasn't the hardest shot I've taken. The way his eyes widened told her he was ready to listen now. Good. Because the next lesson wouldn't be about distance or wind. It would be about why some decisions are made when every rule says they shouldn't be. And why responsibility sometimes means carrying weight no one else sees. The range had gone quiet again, but this time it wasn't tension. It was respect forming in real time. How far can responsibility stretch before it breaks, and who decides when the rules no longer apply? Alina didn't rush into the story. She never did. Silence had always been her ally, a way to make people lean in rather than tune out. The range had quieted again, but this time it was different from before. Not stiff, not fearful, attentive. 200 soldiers stood listening, even if they didn't realize it yet. That wasn't the hardest shot I've taken, she said again, almost to herself. Staff Sergeant Blackwood swallowed. He nodded, adjusting the spotting scope, though he wasn't really looking through it anymore. His focus was on her now, on the lines in her face, the steadiness in her voice. The assumptions he'd made earlier felt heavy, almost embarrassing, but also instructive in a way no formal counseling ever could be. When was it? He asked quietly. Alina paused. Her eyes drifted past the target line, past the red clay hills, past the present entirely. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different weight. Not pride, not drama, memory. Helmand Province, Afghanistan, final deployment. A few soldiers closer to the line shifted unconsciously. The name alone carried gravity. Most of them had studied it in briefings, heard it in stories from older NCOs. A place where mistakes didn't come with second chances. I was 59, Alina continued. Old enough that people assumed I'd be in a headquarters somewhere, pushing paper, advising from a safe distance. She shook her head slightly. I wasn't ready for that. The general and the senior leaders stood off to the side now, deliberately silent. This wasn't a briefing. This was something else. Something that didn't fit neatly into rank or protocol. Alina spoke the way she always had in the field, clear, unembellished, precise. We were overwatch for an airborne platoon. Good soldiers, young, motivated, they walked into a planned ambush. Not chaotic, coordinated, someone smart was running it. She described the terrain, the valley, the radio traffic. The way gunfire sounds different when it's sustained, less sharp, more suffocating. She described watching tracers arc where they shouldn't, understanding immediately what that meant. They were pinned, she said, couldn't maneuver, couldn't break contact. Blackwood felt his chest tighten. He had trained for scenarios like that, simulated them dozens of times. But Alina wasn't talking about a scenario. She was talking about watching real people run out of options. We found the commander, she went on. Not with them, watching from distance, using radios, staying safe. Someone near the back muttered something under their breath. Alina ignored it. He was smart, she said simply. That made him dangerous. She explained the range then, not in numbers at first, but in implication. Beyond doctrine, beyond what was taught, beyond what anyone would recommend if they weren't watching people die. My spotter told me it was too far, she said. He was right. She let that sit. Everything about the shot said no, she continued. Wind, elevation, movement, angle, all wrong. Blackwood finally spoke, so why take it? Alina turned her head slightly, looking at him directly. There was no judgment in her gaze, only honesty. Because sometimes the math isn't about probability, she said. It's about consequence. The range was utterly silent now. Even the wind seemed to have eased, as if listening. I knew air support was coming, Alina said, but I also knew what 15 minutes looked like down there. I had already watched 3 soldiers fall. She described doing the calculations, not dramatically, not heroically, just methodically, Coriolis, altitude, temperature, human behavior, patterns. People like to believe chaos means unpredictability, she said. It doesn't. Under stress, people repeat themselves. They fall into habits because habits feel safe. She had watched him pace, counted his steps, timed his pauses. I waited, she said, because patience was the only advantage I had left. Someone exhaled loudly without realizing it. When the moment came, Alina said, I didn't think about records or rules or whether anyone would ever know. She paused, then added quietly, I thought about the families who didn't yet know they were about to lose someone. The shot, she explained, took almost 3 seconds to arrive. Long enough to doubt yourself if you let it. Long enough to second-guess everything. I didn't, she said. She didn't describe the impact in detail. She didn't need to. The result spoke for itself. The ambush collapsed, she said. Leadership gone, coordination gone, the platoon broke contact. They went home. She looked back toward the soldiers. That shot will never be on a record board, Alina said. It will never be framed on a wall. She shrugged slightly. It doesn't need to be. The silence that followed wasn't awe anymore. It was understanding. Blackwood felt something shift inside him, not just respect, but responsibility. He realized that enforcing rules was easy when nothing was at stake, harder when lives complicated the equation, hardest when you were the one who had to decide. What happened after? He asked. Alina's expression softened just slightly. I packed up, she said. We redeployed weeks later. I retired not long after that. She didn't say why, she didn't have to. I've lived a quieter life since, she added, but I never stopped paying attention. The general stepped closer then. That's why you're here today, isn't it? Alina nodded, because people forget. She looked around the range, at the young faces, the eager ones, the skeptical ones, the ones who reminded her painfully of people she'd once led. They forget that standards aren't just checklists, she said. They're responsibilities. Her gaze returned briefly to Blackwood, not accusatory, not forgiving, simply instructive. And responsibility doesn't disappear just because the person carrying it doesn't look like what you expect. Blackwood straightened slightly. Ma'am, he said, voice steadier now, I won't forget. Alina believed him. Not because he said it, but because he had listened. The range slowly began to breathe again. Soldiers shifted. Commands resumed quietly. But something had changed, not formally, not officially. Internally. Alina stepped back from the rifle, resting her hands lightly on the stock one last time. She didn't know if this lesson would last. Some did, some didn't. But she had learned long ago that you didn't control outcomes. You only controlled whether you showed up when it mattered. And today she had. What do you do when the lesson is learned, but the cost still hasn't been paid? The range slowly came back to life, but it moved differently now. Quieter, more deliberate. Commands were given with care, acknowledgments answered crisply. Soldiers who moments earlier had been focused only on scores and standings now found their attention drifting back toward Alina, as if she carried gravity with her. She felt it and disliked it. Attention had never been the goal. Attention was loud, temporary, it faded. Understanding, that was what mattered. Alina stepped away from the firing line, giving the range back to the competition shooters. She expected that to be the end of it. A lesson delivered. A demonstration completed. She could leave quietly, let the institution process the moment in its own slow, bureaucratic way. But institutions rarely moved on without consequence. General Keller approached her, posture relaxed now, the edge of command replaced by something more human. He spoke quietly, out of earshot of most of the formation. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Elena nodded. "I know." "You could have let me handle it," he added. "No one would have questioned it." She looked at him then, really looked. He wasn't wrong. Authority could have smoothed everything over, paperwork filed, apologies issued, a junior NCO corrected behind closed doors. The system would have protected itself. "That wouldn't have taught what needed teaching," she said. Keller exhaled slowly. He had commanded long enough to recognize truth when it arrived without decoration. "You just complicated a lot of things," he said, not unkindly. Elena almost smiled. That's usually how learning starts. Across the range, Staff Sergeant Blackwood stood alone near the spotting scopes, shoulders squared, gaze unfocused. He looked like someone who had just survived a collision and was still feeling the aftershocks. Elena watched him for a moment. He hadn't run, hadn't deflected, hadn't tried to justify himself once the truth became unavoidable. That mattered more to her than a flawless record ever could. She walked over. He noticed her approach and snapped to attention, reflexive, almost desperate. "At ease," she said gently. He relaxed, though tension still lived in his shoulders. "Ma'am, I don't even know how to start." "That's all right," Elena replied. "Most meaningful conversations don't start cleanly." He nodded, eyes dropping briefly. "I've been thinking about what you said, about assumptions, about fear." She waited. "I didn't realize how much pressure I was under," he continued, "or how much that pressure shaped what I saw. I thought I was enforcing standards, but really, I was protecting myself." There it was. Honesty. Elena leaned lightly against the range table, folding her hands. "Fear narrows vision," she said. "It tells you stories that feel logical in the moment." "I saw an elderly civilian near a weapon that could kill someone instantly," Blackwood said. "And all I could think was, this is the thing that ruins me." Elena nodded slowly. "And so you acted." "Yes, ma'am." "Fear isn't the failure," she said. "Letting it make decisions for you is." He absorbed that quietly. "I accused you of stolen valor," he said, voice tight. I don't know how to live with that." Elena studied him for a long moment, not as a legend, not as a teacher, as a soldier looking at another soldier. "You live with it by never doing it again," she said, "and by correcting it when you see it done to someone else." He met her eyes. "I will." She believed him. Not because he sounded convincing. Because he sounded changed. They stood in silence for a moment, the background noise of the range settling into a distant hum. "You know," Elena said at last, "the first time someone questioned my qualifications, I almost walked away." Blackwood looked surprised. "You did?" She nodded. "Grenada, early 80s, I was young, angry, certain I didn't need to explain myself." "What stopped you?" She smiled faintly. "Someone older than me, someone I'd dismissed." She told him about Chief Mackenzie then, about ignoring his advice, about the ambush that followed, about the quiet correction afterward. "He didn't humiliate me," Elena said. "He didn't make an example of me. He taught me." Blackwood swallowed. "And that's what you're doing now." "Yes," she said simply. He hesitated. "Why?" Elena's answer came without hesitation. "Because someone did it for me, and because the chain breaks if we don't." Not long after, General Keller called the range to a temporary halt. Word spread quickly. Something formal was coming. Soldiers gathered, some sitting on ammo crates, others standing shoulder to shoulder, sweat cooling on their backs as the afternoon sun climbed higher. Keller spoke clearly officially. Announcements, appointments, records, recognition. Alina listened politely, but her attention drifted. She wasn't uncomfortable with acknowledgement. She just didn't linger in it. The words felt like echoes of things long past, catching up at last. When Keller finished, applause broke out, loud, sustained, genuine. Alina nodded once, a small acknowledgement, then looked past the crowd. That's when she saw him. An older man stood near the pavilion, leaning heavily on a cane, watching her with an expression that blended amusement and pride. His hair was thin and white now, his posture bent, but his eyes were unmistakable. Sharp, knowing. Her breath caught. "Sir," she said softly. Chief Mackenzie smiled. "Hello, Alina." For a moment the years collapsed. Grenada, jungle heat. A younger version of herself standing stubbornly in front of a man who had already learned the lesson she was about to learn the hard way. "I heard you were here," he said. "Figured I'd see if the stories were true." She laughed quietly. "You taught me not to believe stories." He chuckled, "And yet here we are." They stood together, watching the younger soldiers return to their positions, the competition resuming with renewed seriousness. "You handled that young sergeant the same way I handled you," Mackenzie said. Alina nodded. "I realized that halfway through." "Full circle," he said. "Yes, sir." He grew thoughtful. "You know the details change, the weapons, the doctrine, the uniforms, but the lesson doesn't." "What lesson is that?" she asked. "That experience is invisible until you need it," he said. "And by then, it's too late to dismiss it." She felt the truth of it settle deep. As the afternoon wore on, Alina prepared to leave. She declined escorts, declined interviews, declined the quiet invitations that would surely turn into obligations if she accepted them. She packed her bag, feeling the familiar ache in her joints, the fatigue that came not from age but from engagement. Teaching took energy. Caring took energy. As she walked toward the parking area, a voice called out, "Ma'am." She turned. A young woman jogged toward her, helmet tucked under one arm, rifle sling cutting diagonally across her chest. Her expression was uncertain but determined. "Private First Class Cortez," she said quickly, coming to attention. I hope I'm not bothering you." "You're not," Alina said. "What's on your mind?" Cortez hesitated. "I'm applying to sniper school. My packet goes up next month." Alina waited. "My platoon sergeant says women don't have the upper body strength for it," Cortez continued. "Says we can't carry the loads, can't maintain the standards." She swallowed. He's not trying to be cruel, he really believes it. Alina studied her, saw the doubt flickering behind the discipline, the same doubt she had carried for years. "Do you?" Alina asked. Cortez straightened slightly. "I don't know anymore." Alina smiled gently. "That's honest." She motioned for Cortez to walk with her. "When I went to Ranger School," Alina said, "they told me the same things. Some of them were even right. Our bodies are different." Cortez glanced at her, uncertain. "But different doesn't mean weaker," Alina continued. "It means you have to be smarter, more efficient, less wasteful." They reached Alina's car. "Here, what the standard doesn't care about," Alina said, opening the door. "Your gender, your age, your doubts. Wind doesn't adjust for confidence. Distance doesn't shorten out of kindness." Cortez nodded slowly. "The only question is whether you can meet the standard," Alina said. "Can you?" "Yes, ma'am," Cortez said, voice stronger now. "Then you belong," Alina said. "Simple as that." Cortez smiled, relief and resolve mixing together. "Thank you." Alina got into her car. As she drove away, the base shrinking behind her, she felt the familiar quiet settle in. Another lesson passed on. Not loudly. Not permanently, but enough. Sometimes strength doesn't announce itself. It waits patiently for someone willing to see it. What happens when the noise fades, and all that's left is what you carry home? The road out of Fort Liberty curved gently through pine and red clay, sunlight filtering through branches like slow-moving memories. Alina drove with both hands on the wheel, posture relaxed but alert, the way it had always been. She didn't turn on the radio. She never did after days like this. Silence helped her sort what belonged to the past and what still needed to be carried forward. Her phone buzzed once on the passenger seat. She ignored it. Some things deserved time before being answered. The truth was, leaving places like that always stirred something uneasy in her chest. Not regret, not nostalgia, something closer to responsibility lingering longer than it should. She had stepped back into a world she had deliberately left years ago, and the door hadn't closed behind her as cleanly as she'd hoped. She stopped at a small diner just off the highway, the kind with cracked vinyl booths, a bell over the door, and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed the same way for decades. She liked places like this. No expectations, no recognition. She sat by the window, ordered black coffee and eggs she barely touched. Outside, a group of young soldiers pulled into the lot, laughing, shoving each other lightly, free in the way only people who hadn't yet been tested by loss could be. Alina watched them without judgment, without envy. She hoped quietly that most of them would never need the lessons she had learned the hard way. Her phone buzzed again. This time she looked. A message from General Keller, short, respectful, asking if she'd consider staying on as an advisor. Nothing formal yet, just a conversation. The institution reaching out, not quite sure how much of her it was allowed to ask for. She set the phone face down. The waitress refilled her cup. "You passing through?" she asked casually. Alina nodded, something like that. "Military?" the woman asked, nodding toward Alina's posture, the way she sat. Alina smiled faintly, once. The waitress didn't press. She never did. Some people understood when not to dig. As Alina paid and stood to leave, her knee protested slightly, age reminding her it was still there, still present, still part of every calculation. She accepted it without frustration. The body spoke. You listened. That was another lesson people learned too late. Back on the road, the phone buzzed a third time. This one wasn't Keller. It was an unknown number. She considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, she answered. "Master Sergeant Hartwell," a young voice said, trying and failing to hide its nerves. Alina recognized it immediately. "Cortez," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I hope I'm not calling too late." "You're fine," Alina said. "What's going on?" There was a pause, a breath taken to steady courage. "I turned in my packet," Cortez said. "Early." Alina smiled to herself. "Good." "My platoon sergeant wasn't happy," Cortez continued, "but he didn't stop me." "Also good." Another pause. Then quieter. "I just wanted to say thank you for yesterday, for not sugarcoating it, for not telling me I could do anything if I just believed hard enough." Alina chuckled softly. "Belief doesn't move weight," she said. "Preparation does." "Yes, ma'am," Cortez said. "That's what I wanted to hear." They talked for a few minutes more. Not about techniques, not about training plans, about fear, about doubt, about how to keep going when the voices around you were louder than the one inside. When the call ended, Alina felt something ease in her chest. Not pride. Relief. She drove the rest of the way home as dusk settled, the sky turning the color of bruised peaches and smoke. Her house sat alone on a quiet stretch of land, modest, practical, exactly what she needed. No trophies on the walls, no framed photographs of her in uniform. The past lived where it belonged. She changed out of her clothes, fed the stray cat that had adopted her years earlier, and settled into her chair as night took hold. Her joints ached now, the delayed cost of engagement. She welcomed it. Pain was information. It meant she was still present. The phone buzzed again. This time, she answered without hesitation. Eleanor, Chief Mackenzie's voice came through, older now, rougher but unmistakable. "You home?" "Yes, sir." "I watched you today," he said. "Not the shot, the part after." She knew what he meant. "You could have ended that young sergeant," he continued. "Embarrassed him, made an example." "I know." "But you didn't," he said. "You chose the harder road." Eleanor leaned back, eyes closing briefly. "You taught me that." A quiet laugh. "I was hoping you'd say that." They sat in silence for a moment, comfortable, familiar. "You ever regret staying so long?" Mackenzie asked finally. Eleanor considered the question carefully, not because it was hard, but because it deserved honesty. "No," she said. "I regret staying quiet when I shouldn't have, and speaking when I should have listened, but staying, no." "That's how I feel too," he said, "even now." They said their goodbyes, simple, unceremonious. After the call ended, Eleanor sat alone with her thoughts. The world liked clean endings, retirement ceremonies, flags folded just right, narratives that wrapped sacrifice into something digestible. Real life didn't work that way. Responsibility didn't end when service did. It just changed shape. She thought about Blackwood, about how he would carry that day forward, whether it would harden him or refine him, whether he would become someone others trusted or someone they learned to avoid. That part wasn't hers to decide. She had given him the tool. What he built with it was up to him. She thought about Cortez, about the long nights ahead, the doubts, the moments when quitting would feel logical, even responsible. She hoped the young woman would remember that standards weren't personal. They were impartial. That was their power. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened field beyond her home. The stars were sharp tonight, clear, unforgiving. Beautiful. She remembered lying on rooftops under skis like this, counting seconds, measuring breaths, waiting for moments that would define lives she would never meet. She had never asked to be remembered. She had only asked to be useful. The phone buzzed one last time. A message from Keller again, this one shorter. "Doors open. No pressure. Thank you for reminding us who we're supposed to be." Eleanor stared at the words for a long moment. Then she typed a response. "Happy to help when it matters." She set the phone down and turned off the light. Tomorrow would be quiet again, ordinary, exactly the way she liked it. But somewhere, a standard had been clarified. A chain strengthened. And a lesson, earned slowly, carried carefully, had moved forward one person at a time. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in the field. They're fought in what you choose to pass on. What remains when the last lesson has been given, and there's no one left to impress. Morning arrived quietly. No alarms, no urgency, just light slipping through the curtains and settling on the hardwood floor like it had nowhere else to be. Eleanor woke the way she always did, slowly, deliberately, testing her joints before trusting them. Age didn't announce itself loudly. It negotiated. She sat at the edge of the bed for a long moment, hands resting on her knees, breathing steady. The dreams had come again, not the loud ones, not the violent ones people expected. These were softer, faces without names, voices without words, moments where everything balanced on a breath she couldn't quite take. She let them pass. Coffee brewed in the kitchen, filling the house with a familiar comfort. Eleanor drank it by the window, watching the field beyond her home wake up. A deer moved cautiously along the tree line. Birds argued over nothing in particular. Life continuing, unconcerned with legacy. She liked that. Her phone sat on the counter, dark and still. No messages, no calls, the quiet after impact. This was the part people never talked about. after the speeches, after the salutes, after the moments that felt meaningful because someone else was watching. What remained was choice. She thought again of General Keller's message, of the door he'd left open. Advisory roles turned into committees, committees turned into policy, policy turned into something rigid enough to lose the very lesson it was meant to preserve. She had lived that cycle before. Once, years ago, she had accepted a similar invitation, sat in clean rooms with polished tables and people who spoke fluently about risk without ever carrying it. She had tried, truly tried, but experience didn't translate well into bullet points. Eventually, she'd walked away. Not because she didn't care, because she cared too much to let her voice become decoration. Elena rinsed her mug and set it upside down to dry. Her movements were slower now, but no less deliberate. Precision had never been about speed. She walked to the small study at the back of the house, the room most people never saw. No trophies, no medals on display, just shelves of notebooks, worn and annotated, spanning decades. She pulled one down. The first page was dated nearly 50 years earlier, her handwriting tighter then, sharper, less forgiving. Mistakes catalogued without mercy. She had learned young that memory lied, paper didn't. She flipped through pages, notes on wind patterns, observations about human behavior under stress, small reminders written to herself after missions that had gone right and ones that hadn't. She paused on a page marked with a simple star. A list of names followed. Not the fallen, the forgotten. Spotters, analysts, medics, locals who had warned them when no one else would. People whose quiet decisions had shifted outcomes without recognition. She traced one name with her finger. Blackwood. She had added it the night before. Not because he had earned redemption yet, but because he had stepped toward discomfort instead of away from it. That was how it started. Her phone rang. This time she answered immediately. "Ma'am," Blackwood's voice came through, steadier than before, still careful. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You're not," Elena said. "What's on your mind?" "I requested a transfer," he said. "Training command, instructor track." Elena leaned back in her chair. "That's a shift." "Yes, ma'am. I realized something yesterday. I'm good at enforcing rules, but I want to be better at explaining why they exist." She smiled faintly. "That takes humility." "I have more of that now," he said quietly. She believed him. "They approved it," he added. "Provisional for now." "That's how it usually starts," Elena said. "Earn it." "I plan to," he replied. "I also wanted to say I corrected one of my squad leaders this morning. He made an assumption about a new soldier. I stopped it." Elena closed her eyes briefly. Let the moment settle. "Good," she said. "That's how chains change." There was hesitation on the other end. Then, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I'm taking responsibility." "That's enough," Elena said, "for now." When the call ended, she sat quietly for a long time. Not satisfied, but at peace. Later that afternoon, she drove into town to pick up supplies. Nothing remarkable. Groceries, feed for the cat, a new notebook. She stood in line behind a woman struggling to count change, a young man impatiently tapping his foot behind her. Elena waited. She always did. On the way out, a teenager held the door open for her. She nodded in thanks. He smiled, unsure why the gesture mattered, but sensing that it did. Small things. They were never small. Back home, Elena sat on the porch as evening approached. The sky stretched wide, clouds painted in slow strokes of gold and gray. Her joints ached more now. A dull reminder that she had spent her life asking her body to do difficult things for longer than most. She welcomed the ache. It meant she had been present. Her phone buzzed once more. A message from Cortez. "Passed the first eval. Long way to go, still scared, still moving forward. Alina typed back. Good, fear means you're paying attention. She set the phone down and leaned back, listening to the wind move through the trees. She thought about the pin, the silver fang, resting in the drawer beside her bed. How it had drawn so much attention at the range. How symbols had power only because people gave it to them. The pin had never made her who she was. The choices had. The waiting, the restraint, the willingness to act when silence became its own kind of failure. She wondered how many more lessons she had left to give. Not many, perhaps, but enough. As night settled fully, Alina stood and went inside, turning off lights as she moved through the house. She paused once more at the study door, glancing at the shelves of notebooks. Tomorrow she would write again. Not for recognition, for continuity. Because someone, someday, would need the reminder. She lay in bed, listening to the quiet, the steady rhythm of a world that kept going whether she watched it or not. Her life had never been loud. It had been deliberate. And that, she knew now, was its own kind of legacy. Strength doesn't always raise its voice. Experience doesn't demand to be seen. And dignity doesn't announce itself when it enters a room. Sometimes it simply stands. Sometimes it waits. And when the moment finally arrives, it acts.